Thermopylae is a small village in central Greece. And if you're visiting, you might think it's just a quiet backwater. You might take in the quaint little houses, the cobblestone streets, the lovely churches. Yeah, nothing to see here. Move along, but stay a moment. Look closer. Feel the echoes of the past. Here, history comes alive. And some will tell you that 2,500 years ago, this was a battlefield. This was the site of one of the most legendary last stands in history. And they will tell you about the Spartans. Now, who doesn't love a good underdog story? This is the tale of how 300 men beat an army, saved their nation, and inspired the world. It's the story of the Spartans. The year was 480 BC, and the Spartans were getting ready for war. The great powers of the Persian Empire were amassing near the city of Phocis, preparing to march on the Greek mainland. Many Greek city-states cowered before them. Some paid tribute, hoping to buy peace. But the Spartans, no, they prepared to fight. Now, this isn't surprising, right? I mean, we know the Spartans as ferocious warriors, hardened by a lifetime of rigorous training and battle. And they did have a large army. At full strength, Sparta could muster over 15,000 soldiers. But the problem was these 15,000 weren't exactly available. See, Sparta's military system was different from other Greek states. Men of military age were required to serve. They'd leave their civilian life behind and join the army, living as a full-time professional soldier. So when war was declared, Sparta couldn't just raise an army. They already had one, sort of. They had to select the force that would go to war. And this is where Sparta had the advantage, because they didn't send everyone. Oh no, not by a long shot. First, they had to pick the Helots, the enslaved people who made up most of Spartan society. Helots were judged as property, chattel to be used or discarded as the ruling class saw fit. Every Spartan man was also surrounded by a cadre of Helot servants assigned to wait on his every whim. And Helots were drafted to serve in the army as well, forming the bulk of the Spartan force. Then there were the perioikoi, the free non-citizens who lived in Sparta. They were merchants, artisans, traders, and they were allowed to own property and participate in civic life. But they couldn't vote, and they couldn't hold political office. Some of the perioikoi also served in the army. Now, all of this might sound pretty undemocratic, and it was. But remember, this was ancient Sparta. Things were different then. Sparta was ruled by two kings, and both were required to be present and accounted for during wartime. Also, since Sparta was technically a monarchy, the king's brothers and sons got first dibs on positions of power. These royal relatives were called the Eupatridae, and they were expected to command the Spartan forces. So far, so good. There was definitely a core group of Spartans who were born into noble families and trained to be warriors. But in the end, they were only a small part of the army. But what about the legends? How did those 300 Spartans get to Thermopylae? Well, it started with the Persians invading Greece. No one knows exactly when the invasion began, but by the summer of 480, the Persian army was massing near the Isthmus of Corinth. The plan was to march north and conquer all of Greece. The Greek states met at the Isthmus and formed a coalition to resist. Athens contributed 100 ships and 10,000 sailors. Corinth sent 700 men. And then there were the Spartans. Now at first, Sparta didn't contribute anyone. In fact, they didn't even attend the meeting at the Isthmus. They preferred to keep their own counsel. But eventually, two Spartan kings, Leonidas and Demaratus, arrived late to the party. The other Greek leaders were eager to put the Spartans in charge, but Sparta wouldn't accept the position. Instead, they suggested picking someone else, preferably someone not late to the meeting. When no one else volunteered, they picked Leonidas. He and his fellow Spartans headed home to assemble an elite fighting force, and they set off north. As they marched, more Spartans joined the army until finally, just outside of the town of Thermopylae, they had 300 men ready for battle. The rest of the Greek force numbered about 7,000 strong, and together they took up a defensive position across the narrow pass. Now, this wasn't really a battle. The Greek force knew they couldn't win against the massive Persian army, so they focused on delaying them, buying time for the rest of Greece to prepare. Each day, the Spartans would come out to fight. And each day, they fought like demons, slicing through the Persians, sending them tumbling back down the mountain. The Spartans were masters of hand-to-hand combat, and they used their superior training to wear the Persians down. And you've got a feel for the Persians. They were a huge force, but they weren't exactly coordinated. Most of the soldiers in the army were conscripts. They were farmers and laborers and traders, and they were forced to put down their tools and take up arms. It wasn't that they weren't brave. Of course they were brave. They just didn't have the kind of training the Spartans had. In fact, Spartan boys began their training in the brutal agog discipline as early as age 7. They were taken from their mothers and sent to live in communal barracks. All of their time was spent in physical exercise, hunting, javelin throwing, wrestling, and endurance running. And it wasn't just about getting stronger. The agog was designed to teach obedience, courage, and selflessness. At age 20, they were considered men, but their training didn't stop. In fact, it intensified. Now they were taught military strategy, logistics, tactics, leadership, basically everything they needed to know to become an effective soldier. And once they were in the army, they continued to train. It wasn't uncommon for a Spartan warrior to spar with another every single day. They also engaged in constant drills, learning how to move as a unit, reacting to imaginary threats, always preparing for real ones. So now you understand why the Spartans were such ferocious fighters, but you still have to ask, how did they manage to stand toe-to-toe with the entire Persian army? Well, part of it was luck. The Spartans reached Thermopylae in early summer, but by midsummer, the whole region was suffering from a terrible heat wave. That made fighting pretty miserable for everyone, but the Spartans were used to the heat. After all, they were marching from Sparta, which sits in the southern Peloponnese. The Persian army, though, was mostly made up of troops from the north. They were used to cooler temperatures, and as the days wore on and the sun beat down, their spirits, along with their bodies, began to break. But the main reason the Spartans managed to stand up to the Persians was their resolve, their commitment to their mission, to their state, to their country. They weren't just fighting for themselves, but for all of Greece, and they weren't going to let down their fellow citizens. Still, after 3 days of intense fighting, the Spartans began to run low on supplies. But that wasn't the reason they gave up. No, instead, they were betrayed. A local resident informed the Persian commander, Xerxes, that there was a mountain path near the rear of the Greek position. The next day, some 8,000 Persian soldiers snuck up the mountain and came down behind the Greeks. They charged into the confused mass of warriors and broke the ranks. One version of the story goes that the Spartan king, Leonidas, hearing the commotion, turned and asked, "This is what it sounds like to be outnumbered." He rallied his men for one last stand, and together they fought to the death. But whether the Spartans went down swinging or fell victim to exhaustion and attrition, no one knows. All that's certain is that none survived. The Persians were victorious at Thermopylae, and soon after, they sacked Athens. But the Spartans had won more than a victory. They'd bought time, enough time for the rest of Greece to prepare for the coming war. 2 years later, the Greek coalition defeated the Persians at the Battle of Plataea, ending the Persian invasion once and for all. And the Spartans, well, they became immortal. If you want to learn more about the Spartans, check out our series on Sparta. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, adventure, and heroism from history's greatest warriors.